As the Navy headed into the Victorian era, it was cursed with a recruitment system which was, quite frankly, chaotic. Whenever a crisis like the Crimean War or the Indian Mutiny sprung up, they would have to scramble to take their ships out of mothballs and then somehow find a crew for them. They'd always relied on the merchant service to train the majority of their men. These were either recruited as volunteers or they'd deploy a press gang. But by the 1850s, impressment was politically unsupportable and practically unsustainable. They'd realised that one volunteer was better than two pressed men, and the sailors themselves were no longer willing to accept it. The superintendent of P&O said that he believed that his sailors would rather die than submit to impressment. Then there was another problem, that the mercantile marine no longer had enough Englishmen in it to be impressed. The ship owners had managed to get the Navigation Acts repealed in 1849, and they were scouring the world for cheaper foreign sailors, who made up 70% of some crews. The Navy tried to fix its supply of sailors in two ways. The first was by offering better conditions, a solution clearly too radical for the merchant ship owners. In exchange for increased pay, faster promotion and more training, they signed up for 10 years of continuous service. The second was to build up a reserve of volunteers willing to be called up should there be a crisis. By 1852, there were three main reserves. There was the Coast Guard Service, which consisted of men who had already served in the Navy. There was the Seamen Riggers of the Royal Dockyards, who were also ex-naval men employed to fit out ships for sea. And finally, the third option was the Royal Naval Coast Volunteers. These were fishermen and ferrymen who had been recruited into the reserves by the lure of a 10-shilling bounty. In 1858, the Royal Naval Coast Volunteers had 6,000 men, with more being recruited every month. This was also the year that another reserve force was created, the Volunteer Reserve Force, later renamed the Royal Naval Reserve. By 1869, it was well established and joined by the Royal Naval Artillery Volunteers in 1873. The Royal Fleet Reserve was added in 1901 for men who had finished their period of continuous service on a naval pension. As we enter the 20th century, even more types of reserve were added. These include the Shetland Royal Naval Reserve, the Royal Naval Reserve Pigeon Service, the Royal Naval Motorboat Reserve, the Army and Navy Canteen Board, the Royal Navy Reserve Anti-Aircraft Corps, which shot down the first Zeppelin, and the Royal Navy Volunteer Reserve Shore Wireless Service. This last one was set up in 1915 for men operating the listening station which fed back information to naval intelligence. The operators were getting harassed by women who thought they should be at the front, so the Admiralty converted them all into members of the Royal Navy Volunteer Reserve. Once they had their uniforms, they could walk around again without fear of somebody flinging a white feather in their faces. There was also the Trawler Reserve, which was set up in 1911 for minesweeping and anti-submarine work. It was an initiative by Admiral Charles Beresford, who had dreamed it up after a visit to the fishing port of Grimsby in 1907. The members of this force remained distinct from the Royal Navy's reserves. They would only be called up for the length of hostilities, and they served on their own trawlers. As far as the regular Royal Navy was concerned, these trawlermen's discipline left a lot to be desired, even when compared to the rest of the reserve forces. However, one trawler did manage to sink a U-boat that was trying to enter the Grand Fleet's base at Scapa Flow in 1914. All of the other reserves were drilled like sailors and taught everything that they would need to know should they be called up to join the fleet. Anybody above the age of 17 could join, but 14-year-olds were also allowed to join as buglers. Recruitment and training of boys was never happened at a grand scale, despite the efforts of the training ships who would get a £3 bounty for any boy that joined the reserves. The training ship Exmouth made sure all of its lads were able to immediately qualify for the Royal Naval Reserve, as did the Marine Society's training ship, the Warspite. Warspite accepted boys who seemed unlikely to get past the Royal Navy Reserve Medical, but with regular drill and better food than they would have had in the slums, they might still get over the line. Boys of 15 or 16 had to be at least 4'10" in height and 29 inches around the chest in order to be accepted. The training ship would then receive its £3 bounty, and the lads' time on board would count towards the time they needed for promotion. Once they reached the age of 18, they were eligible for the second-class reserve, and after 2 years at sea as a merchant seaman, they were eligible to be a first-class member of the reserve. For this, they would receive £6 a year, up from the £2.10 that they would get as part of the second-class reserve. They were paid quarterly, and if they were injured while on duty, they were entitled to the same pension as any other sailor in the Navy. Another draw to sending up the reserves was the uniform. A smart uniform was important in Victorian times, and being a sailor was seen as the pinnacle of muscular Christianity. One naval recruit said, "Mighty pride, I tell you, I felt when I first put on my new Jolly Jack's uniform." Even lads on the reformatory ships, such as the Akbar, liked the fact they wore a naval uniform. One wrote back to the people that had sent him to the reformatory and told them how proud it made him feel when he was ashore, because people assumed that he was in Her Majesty's service. However, having been in a reformatory, this is as close as he would have got to join the Royal Navy. The two lads released on licence from the reformatory Clarence tried to join up, only to be sent back to the Clarence for another 2 years. The uniforms they had worn on the Clarence and the Akbar were actually closer to the Royal Navy uniform than those worn by the Royal Navy Artillery Volunteers. The only difference a reformatory boy would have was the name on his cap tally. The artilleryman had a different cap tally, silver badges, and the tape trimmings on his collar were wavy. The uniform of the Royal Navy Volunteer Reserve had a similar feature, which gave it the nickname the Wavy Navy. If the pay and uniform got people to volunteer, it was the esprit de corps that made them stay. The Inns of Court had both a Royal Navy Volunteer Reserve unit and a Volunteer Rifle Corps regiment, known as the Devil's Own. One young law student recalled the thrill of being able to dine with a Lord Justice when they were both drilling with their regiment. Some of the Devil's Own fought during the Second World War, and during the First World War, almost all of the young barristers volunteered to join either the Army or the Navy. The RMVR unit had a gun mounted on Victoria Embankment to fire at German aircraft, and they drilled in the gardens. Each member of the Royal Navy Reserve was required to take a 14-day drill course during their first year, and drill for 28 days a year. After the first year, they did not have to spend more than 1 week at a time at the drill hall, but they did have to attend at least 2 drills a month in order to keep them up to the standard. They were taught general seamanship, rowing, swimming, and rope work. They were also taught to operate as part of the crew of one of the great guns of the fleet. Many brigades formed in sailing clubs, or they created their own, so that the volunteers could get their sea legs. One group of volunteers even took a schooner as far as the Azores. All of these drills were there to make sure that they could take up a position in the fleet should the needs arise. By 1904, there were 146,000 men in the Naval Reserves who could be called up by royal proclamation. When the proclamation was made, they had to apply to the nearest naval officer or registrar of Naval Reserve. When the First World War broke out, they were called up, only to find that the fleet did not need them. Churchill advocated for a naval division to be sent to Belgium to fight in the trenches. Amongst them was Arthur Asquith, the son of the Prime Minister, much to his stepmother's annoyance, and next time we'll be going through what happened to them in Belgium.